Welcome to The Strategic Leader, the podcast for people-focused leaders who want to think, act and feel more strategic. I'm Gemma Bullivant.
And I'm Fee Craig. In this series, we're tackling the big, hairy questions shaping the world of work and exploring how to respond with strategic clarity, not just strong opinions.
Welcome back to The Strategic Leader with me, Gemma Bullivant.
And with me, Fee Craig.
And we are delighted to welcome another guest on today's episode. We have with us today Geraldine Gallacher. Geraldine, would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yes, certainly. I'm Geraldine and I'm Chief Executive of the Executive Coaching Consultancy. And I'm President of City Women's Network. And I've written a book called Coaching Women, Changing the System, Not the Person. And lastly, I do an On Balance flow. And I also have a podcast, Gemma, which is Shifting the Needle.
We'll put those all in the show notes. So thank you for that, Geraldine. And as we know, in Series 4, we're tackling the big, hairy strategic questions. We are doing that through the lens of bringing our own thoughts and views and perspectives, really open to being challenged, open to considering other perspectives, lifting ourselves perhaps up from any opinions that we think might be a little entrenched. And today's big, hairy strategic question is, why are there still so few women in leadership roles?
That is a big, hairy strategic question. And I wish I had can you get a big, hairy answer? But I really do wish that I had a simple answer. But as with all big, hairy questions, audacious questions, the thing is that it's complex and it's nuanced. And what I will say is that I did have bias for a long time in my thinking, which was that flexible working would solve the problem. So for many, many years, and I've been kicking this question around since 2005, actually, having started the company in 1994, we coached mainly men. And I have to admit, I didn't really notice, particularly because I was very much part of the system as well. So I was coaching mainly men, and then realized when Emma Spitz joined, and she joined on our second maternity leave, and she made the point that she would never have left the company that she was in had they not managed the process of her becoming a mother more effectively, because she felt mummy tracked. And that, believe it or not, that simple conversation and that exchange and that relationship with Emma completely changed my thinking about women. And first of all, it made me notice that actually there are too few women in leadership. Now, that sounds ridiculous because it's mentioned so many times now. But just to give you some context, the Lord Davies report that first talked about that pipeline graph, the leaky pipeline was what was called. That was actually 2011. And so we were having this conversation in 2005. And that really opened my eyes to the problem of why there's so few women. Now, the reason I introduced that is because actually it's quite germane to what I think one of the big problems is. And I think one of the big problems with why there's so few women in leadership is actually, it sounds very controversial, but it's because women still have children. And that isn't in any way to denigrate the possibility you can have children and work and have a career. I absolutely passionately believe you can, but I honestly don't think the system's caught up with the words, because the words are all very flexible working. We do this, we do that. The culture and the reality doesn't match. So, and hence the book, Coaching Women, Changing the System, Not the Person, because there really is nothing wrong with women. And 80% of the people, of the women that we coach, around 80% will actually have a child. So it's a significant proportion. But we coach a lot of women that haven't had children, don't want to have children as well. And the systemic kinks affect them too.
Interesting. So that sounds like, to me, like your thoughts on what the main causes are for there being so few women in executive roles. Could you maybe build on that a little bit and and help us to understand what that then means. So obviously, if women are not progressing through, there must be some knock-on effects to that in terms of the women that are at earlier stages in their career.
Yeah.
What do you think the impacts are in that earlier population?
I think for the earlier population, and I was in that population, well, we all were at one point in that population. I think the awareness of the systemic barriers is not very clear. I think
Mm,
I often have conversations with women in their 20s who feel that, Geraldine, that's a bit old hat. We don't want to talk, it's gender fluidity. And I totally get it. It's so binary to talk about men and women. My feeling is, I know the conversation about gender has moved on and identity is more fluid, and I agree with and can see that and I understand it. But my point is I'm only dividing the conversation into men and women because the system is doing it, but it's doing it inadvertently because I think it's about leadership. And I think the prevalent style of leadership is the strong take charge. And, in the research, it would call it agentic, with an agenda. And that is people that, are quite decisive, maybe socially dominant, want to take control of things, quite extrovert usually, often, not necessarily though extrovert by the way, but just people that want to take charge. And I know this is very binary as well, but then you have other people that perhaps have more of a take care leadership style, which is about thinking more about the stakeholders that work for them and thinking about how can I look after and how can and maybe more of a collaborative style. And we call that communal style. So I think that is really important, the distinction between an agentic style and a communal style. And I think one of the big problems in stereotyping is women are stereotyped to be supposed to be take care people, and men are stereotyped in supposedly they're supposed to be take charge. Yeah. Now that's a massive generalization. I know I'm a take charge person and I have to work on my take care. I know that. I don't know where you both sit on that spectrum yourself. If you had to place yourself.
mm,
I would say probably slightly more take charge. I'd probably say the same about Gem. But
yeah.
really, it's really interesting because no matter what I may perceive about myself, I guess your point is the system may not see me as such. And so I'm going to get channeled. And I'm also thinking about, you said about stereotyping for men, is there still this lurking perception that leaders look a certain way, the slightly dominant, the extrovert, the sort of leaders that I'm sort of thinking of the Wolf of Wall Street kind of suits and whatnot. Is there still an influence towards men that they need to behave like that? They need to behave.
I think that, I mean,
I do-
see, that's the nub of it, is that the other cognitive shortcut or bias that we all, men and women, suffer from is we do associate leadership with take charge.
yeah.
And because we stereotype men as being take charge, we therefore associate men with being leaders. And there isn't a natural cognitive shortcut that women are natural leaders. There just isn't. And this,
Mm,
Warren Bennis coined the expression think manager, think man 60 years ago, I think it was. And actually
mm.
think by now, surely that's not still the case, but it is. It's still, the research still points to a natural propensity for us to think that men are better leaders.
Yeah, and when we were talking before we started recording, Geraldine, a few days ago, you mentioned to me something that's stuck with me, which was all around this you described it as a mismatch. The leadership qualities valued by organizations, these agentic qualities, the ones that are typically male in nature, and the mismatch of those qualities with what employees value. I know them as push and pull behaviors,
Yeah.
and the pull behaviors of working with someone, collaborating, a gentle persuasion, and working with someone to bring them with you as opposed to pushing them in a certain direction. That there's this mismatch of organizations wanting more push and employees wanting more pull. What's your take on that?
I've been working in the area of inclusive leadership for quite a while. And the challenge with that particular way of thinking is that the research all points to how leaders over-index on agentic behaviour. So push. Leaders at the moment, the people that make it through over-index on agentic, and usually in a coaching conversation, because to be a good leader, I think people get that you can't do all push because you'll be aggressive if you just do all push. And equally, you can't do all pull because if you do all pull, you'll actually be seen as passive. It won't be like, people want their leader to go and represent them. So you've got to have an element of both, don't you? Push and pull. But in my work with inclusive leadership, people have associated inclusive leadership with, as you say, the word gentle. And I would challenge back on that, Gemma, because I actually think pull behaviours can be hugely assertive and more so than some agentic behaviours. So, for example, and I've noticed this, apart from the research, my own experience as a leader, not just as a coach, but as a leader, I noticed that if I push all the time, people can switch their brains off.
I was
Because I'm used
thinking that
to
earlier
the
on. You're the one that's taking charge, making the decisions. This is what we're going to do. You ultimately, I would guess, perhaps rather crudely, you kind of disempower everyone else. Everyone else is going to sit around and wait to tell them what to do. And that generates a whole series, a whole culture, a whole series of behaviors, a whole productivity issue. Made me think of those two things, the lack of women at senior level and the lack of productivity. Could they possibly be connected, I wonder?
I like those associations, but it's too big a jump, and it's
Yeah,
certainly too big
yeah.
a jump for people to accept. There is a clear relationship in terms of the numbers of performance in organizations with more women on the board, that those companies do better. And people don't even accept that as a causal relationship fee. There is still the argument put, which is, if a company's that successful, maybe it could afford to have women on the board.
Ah, so they're successful, and so they've added the women on afterwards as
Yes.
box ticking or as an optics.
Then it's astonishing twist of logic in my eyes, but it's not. So you will find that most literature and research that talks about the relationship between having women on the board and performance, make a big point of saying it's not causal. Now, I think making that point is sexist.
Yes.
Yes, I do, because the data is there. We normally accept data when there's a relationship, but yet there's a question mark about it. So it's just, statistically it's correct. It's not causal, but why would we even be thinking that? Why would you not just think, oh, that's really interesting when there are more women and ethnic minorities, even more so, there's an even greater performance boost when you have a more diverse board. And yet, I have actually heard people say, yes, but Geraldine, actually just articulate it, not just the fact that you see it in the research, articulate, yes, but Geraldine, maybe they're doing so well they can afford to. You think, what, can't you see in that wording, can't you see the racism and the sexism? It's just astonishing. But
Yeah.
But going back to where we were, which is about the communal and the agentic, and why is it that we have this mismatch? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. As an HR professional, it really leads me to think about behaviours and those we reward, behaviours we incentivize, behaviours that we seek when we're looking to promote, when we're looking at leadership programs. What have you seen in relation to that, where there's this, I suppose, perhaps alternative way of looking at how to encourage a better balance of agentic versus the communal, or the push versus the pull?
I think it's, as I was saying, I've seen it as a leader. I've seen how, and I was making the point that I don't think pool is gentle. I think actually you put people under more pressure when you ask them a really good open-ended question. Like, when someone, instead of talking at them, if you say, what do you think we should do?
Yes.
the brains
Yes.
go on, you then see just how brightly are their bulbs lighting up. So who's actually present and who
Mm.
isn't? I mean, I'm not saying you do it just for that, because obviously I wouldn't have leaders on my team that weren't present and their bulbs are always bright. But nonetheless, it's how much do they understand this? Also, what's their perspective on it? What am I missing?
Mm.
Then what can I add to this? What am I missing? So I want to find out. And so I've personally gone on a journey as a leader to recognize that my agentic style can get in the way, and that actually I value, and obviously as a coach, you learn these skills, which is fantastic because it wasn't natural to me. Maybe the curiosity was. So I've always asked difficult questions, funnily enough, when I was at school, apparently. So maybe the curiosity was, the questioning was there. However, I've learned the value of how delegation happens, empowerment happens, and genuinely people bring more to the party if I shut up. Yeah.
And so we can probably agree wholeheartedly with what you've just said. It's empowering for other people, for them to be able to see some kind of responsibility in decision making and so on. So you're absolutely preaching to the converted here. For listeners who find themselves, in a situation where the model, the behaviour is rewarded, the promotion is given to those people who are not in that world. I guess, we've discussed the system, and your point overall then is don't change the system, don't change the person, change the
Yeah.
system. How do we start to change that system?
Oh my God, that's the
No,
million dollar.
I'm asking it like it's a straightforward question.
Just 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah.
That should do it.
Or any ideas that can help us move the dial a bit if we can't solve it.
Definitely. I mean, for example, I do still believe that there's value in women's leadership development programs. Yeah. And it's controversial.
Women only, you mean?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, go on.
And the reason I think there's a value for them is that you cannot assume that all women have their eyes opened to the system or the systemic bias. And what you can assume is that more women than men will take personal responsibilities, look slight at when things go awry. They are, I believe that we are primed, because we're all women on this cast. I believe that we are primed to be more self-deprecating and more self-checking and possibly more self-aware. Yeah. I think I can watch it with my own children. I can just see even how they played together, how the boys reinforce agentic behavior and the girls reinforce, no, you first. What do you think? I'm not sure. It's much more of a ticket to the game. I know it's a boyish, well, it doesn't need to be a boyish analogy since women play games as well. But it's almost a ticket to the game for boys to be able to go, I can win this. And it's almost and be popular. And it's a ticket to the game for women to go, oh, does my bum look too big in this? Oh. Self-deprecation is rewarded socially amongst women. And I think self-promotion is rewarded socially among boys. And I think we imbibe a lot of that, and so therefore, when you are naturally agentic, because I think that's a socialized, but if you're naturally, and who knows how much agentic and communal behavior is, of course, you imbibe that through role modeling as well. But then you then learn through the system, like I have, that, maybe I said too much. Maybe I was being a bit too bullish. Maybe I am a little bit aggressive in my Scottish accent, the way I quickly think and then have an opinion on things quite quickly. Oh gosh, maybe that is a bit too much. And yet, if you took exactly what I was doing and put it into the mouth of a man and played that, as all the research has done, by the way, exactly the same wording, the same intonation, it doesn't sound aggressive when it comes. And that's because our expectations of women is not to be aggressive. And our expectations of men is that you can be. The dominance thing's quite attractive, whereas dominance in women is not attractive. And that's the thing I'm saying about having women in the room is not all women get that.
Okay.
Jen?
So the point of having women all together is to provide an environment whereby that can be explored and the awareness be raised to enable them to see that better.
Yeah. So make them aware of where are you on this? Where are
Okay.
you in relation to others? And where are you in relation to the system? So that when
Mm.
we're talking about confidence, we don't go down the route of, "Oh, all women are not lacking in confidence." That's actually not true. And also it's different depending on the stages of your life.
Mhm.
There's quite a lot of research that shows that in a work context, in a work context, by the way, not coming out of academia, because that's different because women are doing very well in academia. But in a work context, what's really fascinating, despite coming out with more firsts, more graduates are female, usually often do very well in interviews. And despite that, they come into the workforce, and when you measure their confidence in the workforce, specifically compared to young men, women self-report less confidence than men.
Yeah.
Now, and then if you look at how that changes over time, men over 50, I know it's not always age, but stage of life, flatten out in terms of their confidence and then in fact dip, whereas women just keep on going up. And so woe betide married couples like myself and my poor husband, where when he married me, I was probably a lot more malleable than I am now because your voice. I think you do. You find your voice as you get older. And funnily enough, that's what's really fascinating is men sort of lose their voice a little bit. Not all of
Yeah.
them. It's certainly not the ones storming around the political stage. So you have to, I'm talking about the general population, not those outliers, really, outlier leaders. So why do
That's
people vote for that? Why are people attracted to that dominant, forceful leadership? I mean, I just wouldn't have thought young people of today would go for that, and yet they are in their, significant proportions of people, young people, when you talk about politics, believe that they need a leader that's going to be definite and, like a Trump or a Putin or an Erdogan or name them quite a lot,
yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
the agentic style. And yet,
Yeah.
can you imagine managing a Gen Y or Gen Z person with that management style? Can you imagine the response you'd get?
Yeah.
I mean, it just doesn't compute.
So
And that
what I'm hearing that is a perspective I hadn't really thought about, which is why we have these conversations, right? So I came to this not having considered your point about some women are not coming into this with their eyes open. And obviously some men aren't, of course. And I recognize it's very inconvenient when you start noticing all of these things, when you start noticing microaggressions, when you start noticing systemic misogyny and sexism in the workplace. And I definitely spent a good couple of decades going, "Oh no, that didn't happen to me." I was lucky. I sailed through all that. That didn't happen to me. And then I look back and I realize, of course, it happened. It happened all the time, and it still happens. But it's not very convenient once you start spotting it. It feels almost like a burden to carry because you're like, "Oh God, I have a responsibility to do something about this now. I can't let people off the hook once I've spotted it." And that makes me unpopular. That makes me have to sort of step into unpopular situations. And to come back to your point about, well, there's a lot of studies which I think we all know about around likability or amiability as a character that is ranked incredibly highly in women and not as highly as men. So that, having to step out of that, okay, I know that I'm not going to be liked for this, but I'm going to have to say it now anyway. I guess that's from my own experience, but it's borne out by data, isn't it? In terms of
Oh, very much so.
step out of being amiable and likable, then you
Uh,
pay a price for it as a woman. Way that
and the strange thing is of all the, I've coached so many men that are people pleasers. Yeah. So it's not being amiable is not a gender. It genuinely isn't gendered. There's many men that are real people pleasers. And I would almost contend because executive coaching consultancy would come in at professional level, would come at quite a high level. I would almost contend that there's a lot of women that we coach that are not like that for the simple reason they wouldn't have got in the first place.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
assertive behavior, I'm sure it forged the fact that I could sell myself, that I could take the banter, that I could give as good as I get, all that kind of thing. In other words, being quite agentic
Yeah.
and seemingly tough-minded. I'm sure that would have meant that I was attractive to them because I fitted in. I did fit in the system, and I didn't think there was anything wrong with the system either. I thought leaders should be agentic as well. It's just with experience and age, I have recognised that it's just not the most successful way to lead. And I was a leader at a very young age. You know, I was managing by 25, 26, and then I was leading by the time I was 29. You know, I had a big team by 29. So I was young and I was learning on the job, and I could feel, oh, this isn't quite working. Me telling them all what I think we should be doing isn't quite working. And I just had to work through, how the hell do I? And then I discovered,
Yeah.
lots of tools that made me realize, think differently.
And there's something in that, isn't there, about role models? Because if with so few women in leadership roles, and the ones that are there tend to be on the agentic end of the scale because that's the system, and the men that go through are both agentic
Yeah,
and communal, because the men have got a little bit more
but
grace around them to succeed with either style, then the women that are coming through are seeing their role models in the female version of being effectively really quite agentic. And I've coached someone recently, female, early, mid stages of her career, but landed into a leadership role and expected to figure it out. And hence I was working with her. And I asked her about role models for leadership qualities and, what kind of leader would you like to be? What behaviours and qualities would you aspire to have? And she struggled to answer the question. So we started to talk about, well, who think about some real people around you. And her immediate answer, it was so instinctive, was, I don't have any role models. I don't have any leaders that I can use as role models. The COO that I told you about she's the only woman and she's left now, so I don't have any role models. And I found that really
yeah,
fascinating, also really surprising, because I hadn't been thinking in a gendered way. I'd been thinking about leadership qualities regardless of whether they happened to be men or women. But she obviously could only instantly
oh yeah,
relate to women as role
absolutely.
models.
I just think that's the human psyche. You can't be what you can't see. It's just so much easier. I mean, I became an executive coach, believe it or not, because I was head of management development. So I did all general leadership development programs and all that kind of thing. And I saw a television program called The Executive Coach, and it was a woman that was the executive coach. Now, it didn't occur to me that the reason that spoke to me back in 1992, the reason that spoke to me was because she was a woman. Because I think if it had been a man and they showed him, if it showed, this television program worked with the coach and worked with the board of a big insurance company over a number of months, and she was flying in from America, and she'd go to do one-to-ones with them, and then she'd do a team session with them. And I remember sitting watching it and saying to Mike, my husband, that is my job. And I was
Mm,
29. I was 31, 32, and I said, that is my job. That
mm,
is exactly what I want to do. I don't think I would have seen that if it hadn't been the fact that she was a woman.
mm, mm.
Because I think we do think in gender terms. We do, unfortunately. We have been socialized to not be able to see not be able to be what you can't see. And I think going back to your earlier point, Gemma, which is that a lot of women to make it through have to be really quite agentic. But do you know what's really frustrating is actually a lot of those women that have come through are not being any more agentic than the men at all.
No, just
However, the number of times when I'm doing a speech and at the end of it, I take questions, you will have a younger female in the audience that will say, how come the worst boss I've ever had is a woman? Without fail, I have that.
mm,
How many male bosses have you had that are rubbish? And as well as which I do have, and this is an opinion, and I think it'd be a fascinating study, is I have an intuition that women manage performance more than men do.
mm.
I think those people pleaser men do make it through, but I'm not convinced they're that effective as managers. So if you are working for someone who isn't, and this is who isn't managing your performance, you can have a laugh with them, you can like them, you can enjoy that
Yeah.
experience. Then you get a woman who's like, well, Geraldine, what's this leading to? What are you trying to do? Doesn't want to go down the pub with me, but actually wants to know what I'm doing. You think, oh,
Oh, that's fascinating, isn't it? Look, I'm conscious of wrapping up very soon. If there was one thing that you thought that organisations could focus on to really shift the needle, to use your fabulous language there, but in the context of women and helping address the balance of women in senior leadership, what do you think would be really valuable for them to focus on?
I think focusing on changing up women's development programs to involve men in them. I think we are at the time now where that's becoming and figuring out how do you address the systemic bias without it being like an unconscious bias training program, but actually much more about understanding maybe in the room, let's have all those who've got an agentic style and them realizing that as many women are agentic as men and
Mm,
realizing that there's a hell of a lot of men that actually have got quite a strong take care aspect to their lives and recognizing that the system doesn't necessarily work for those men that want to have a more fulfilled life, which allows them to have to parent out loud, as the expression goes, because there is a definite bias against men taking time out to be with young children. And there's an expectation that women will take time out, and we need to stop. So if we could stop gendering taking care and taking charge, and also see parenting as a joint endeavour, which would mean making sure that it's equal parental leave, not shared parental leave where women gift half of their. And naturally, I think recognising that particular transition is incredibly tough. And so therefore, coaching for people through that transition, men and women, through that transition, including the managers, is key. And I also think group coaching for senior women is very important as well, because I
mm,
think once you become in the minority, there's a natural network that men have, but actually pulling women together to keep them sane and to recognize some of the challenges that they're experiencing are actually systemic. And I think that's really important.
Oh, some great things there and some great ideas. We'll capture all of that in the show notes. And as we said at the start, we'll also make sure that there's ways in which you can get in touch with Geraldine and find out a bit more about the work that she does and her book and all the other fabulous stuff that Geraldine does in this space. Look, thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure. I could talk for hours on this, quite frankly, but we
So
don't have that.
and I definitely talk with both of you for hours on this. I think we'd all have similar but challenging views of each other because we have to keep challenging the notions because as you said at the very beginning, Gemma, the problem hasn't been resolved. And I actually think we're going a bit backwards. And I think the numbers will start to show that in the next couple of years. And before we know it, the DEI backlash will be the backlash to the DEI backlash.
Well, and it's isn't it incredible how each of our subject matters takes us into a whole nother massive area that we could explore. It feels very, very central. I feel like I've had some of my thoughts challenged. I've definitely got some new perspectives as a result of this conversation. And I particularly want to hang on to that language of stop gendering those kinds of behaviours.
Mhm.
It's assumptions that we bring, and stop gendering the principle of taking care, or particularly with when it comes to parental leave and who leaves the office and who takes care of the children at a societal level. To kind of that idea about stop gendering it is a
Mm.
really powerful thing that I really want to take away. So, Geraldine, thank you so very much for joining us here on the Strategic Leader podcast. We've really, really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Strategic Leader. We'd love it if you could subscribe or maybe share with a colleague or just leave us a quick review.
And if you have a big, hairy question you'd like us to explore, or perhaps a strategic dilemma you're wrestling with, just drop us a line, gemma@gemmabullivant.co.uk.
And remember, having a strategic viewpoint doesn't necessarily mean having all the answers. It's more about asking better questions, broadening your view, and staying curious.
We'll see you next time.